afternoon, everyone. I think we're about ready to get started. Betsy worked at CPL for a number of years and was at the Kennedy School, so she's reuniting with lots of old friends today as well. So thank you all for joining us. Welcome to today's event, which is sponsored by the Center for Public Leadership's Student Advisory Board. My name is Amy Novarita, and I am on the Student Advisory Board, and I'll be moderating today's event. It is with great pleasure that I introduce Betsy Myers today, who will share her perspective on President-elect Barack Obama and leadership, campaign, and his administration. Betsy Myers served as a senior advisor for Barack Obama's presidential campaign. She joined the campaign in January of '07, where she served as the chief operating officer throughout the primary, and then in the general campaign she went on to serve as chair of Women for Obama. Today, she is a member of the transition team. Prior to this appointment, Betty was the executive director of the Center for Public Leadership, which is a position that she took on in 2003. She came to CPL to bring her proven track record of building, growing, and strategically realigning organizations. She has previously been a senior official in the Clinton administration, where she was the president's senior advisor on women's issues and the very first director of the White House Office for Women's Initiatives and Outreach. She also worked in the U.S. Small Business Administration, first as director of the Office of Women's Business Ownership, and later as Associate Deputy Administrator for Entrepreneurial Development. Very long title. Previously, she was a public service fellow at the Kennedy School of Government, and she graduated with a mid-career master's in public administration in 2002. She then served as the school's director of alumni programs and external relations before coming to the Center for Public Leadership. We're thrilled to welcome her back today. The last time Betsy spoke at the Kennedy School was last spring, and Obama's candidacy was anything but certain at that point. So things have changed quite a bit in the meantime, and it's very exciting to have her back this afternoon. I will begin today with some questions for Betsy, and then we'll open up the floor for more questions. One kind of administrative detail, there is a kind of clipboard with a sign-in sheet going around. If folks could continue to circulate that throughout the event today, that would be terrific. For now, if you could all join me in welcoming Betsy Myers. So we're enthusiastic to start today. You know, in signing up to attend Center for Public Leadership events, we ask people to share kind of the reason that they're here today. And despite the fact that we've all read the Newsweek coverage, seen the television coverage, gone online, there's still a burning question. Everyone wants to know kind of what was the secret? What did the Obama campaign do to win this election? And so we wanted to talk with you a bit today, Betsy, kind of as somebody who's been engaged at the high level throughout the campaign. If you could share with us kind of any new information as to in terms of what you believe the secret was to the campaign and kind of what your perspective is from the inside.
Well, it's great to be here back at the Kennedy School. It feels like being home. And so many of my good friends, like Barbara Kellerman and others, that I thought a lot about you all along the road. And really the reason that I went into the campaign was because of my love and curiosity about leadership and why leaders do what they do. And I think that is kind of the answer to number one question is, you know, I think what we had in this campaign was not only a well-run campaign, and I'll talk a little bit about that, but the candidate himself was a really unique candidate. And I've been in politics a long time. I go back to my first campaign, which totally dates me. And I think I left this off when I met most of the campaign staff who were born after this campaign. But the Mondo Ferraro campaign in 1984 was my first campaign, so I watched a lot of presidential campaigns and other local elected officials run for office, and I was very taken with Barack. You know, we started to look at Barack's leadership at the Center for Public Leadership before I went there, and he really was kind of he stood for this new kind of leadership thinking, which is, you know, this new generation, someone who listens, someone who collaborates, doesn't think they know everything. You know, one of the things I was really intrigued with Barack, and still am intrigued with him, is that he's a learner. And so I always say that's one of the most important things of a leader, is that you're a learner. You don't think you know everything, and that you're continually growing because you don't have all the answers. And from the day one of our campaign, Brock said, gosh, I've never run for president before. And you know what, it's probably a long shot. And so we're gonna do two things in this campaign. And he said this to the first senior staff meeting. And he said, number one, we're gonna run the best run campaign, an organized campaign. And number two, we're gonna have kind of a what the heck kind of attitude. And in the beginning, that's kind of how we went into it. And don't take ourselves so seriously, that we're gonna go out and change the world, but we're gonna do it a little differently. And I think he brought this kind of, a different kind of thinking, because Brock said early on, and this is the other thing about him, he's so authentic, that if I am who I am and I win, then great. But if I am who I am and I lose, then so be it. And so I think you saw that his personal leadership skills, not thinking he knew everything, learning as we went along, being authentic and true to who he is, being committed to running a campaign that was different. Now, in the context of being a learner, Brock did a couple things. One, he studied George Bush's campaign of 2000. And one of the things George Bush did really well in his campaign is he ran his operational campaign very buttoned up. And most Democrats, historically, have not run their campaigns buttoned up. They haven't even had operational departments. Governor Dean in '04 didn't even know how much money was in the bank at any given time. They had no operational model. So Brock said, we need to run our campaign like a business. Now, little did we know in those early conversations, and that we would be raised the kind of money that we did. And we raised, in '07, we raised $103 million, which was even then beyond our wildest expectations. When you think about months in the later stages of the campaign, which we raised that money in a month, to think we raised that money in a year, but that was unprecedented. And just to give you some historical perspective, if you compare Bill Clinton 91 to Barack Obama 07, so 16-year difference. Bill Clinton was just staffing up his senior team in fall of '91. We've been going almost a year. Bill Clinton raised $3 million in '91. We raised $103 million. The primaries got earlier and earlier. As you remember, Iowa was January 3rd, and New Hampshire was January 8th. We had actual conversations in the Obama campaign that there was talk that New Hampshire was going to push to December 11th, which would mean that Iowa would have gone earlier. So really unprecedented when you think about how the calendar has moved so much. But back to the original question about why were we so successful? I think you had a really unique candidate who stayed steady. And we're talking about change, and so there's a lot of change going on, and a lot of change in our world and our country, but you have a candidate who stays steady. Never veer from the strategy. Because our strategy was very simple. Very simple. And I think when you look at leaders who go into organizations, it's so easy to get pulled in a million directions. Everybody has a great idea. Everybody has an event that you should be at, because that's the most important event to them. Right? And in the beginning, I remember David Plouffe, our campaign manager, who's one of the most disciplined, focused people I've ever worked with. He said no to almost everything. Because over and over again, our campaign in the early days was very simple. Brock's time will be spent in 3 ways, actually 4 ways. 1, we will go to the early states, Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, and Nevada. People didn't know him. Remember, when Barack Obama started this 2 years ago, he was less than 10% name ID in the country. Think about that. So nobody knew him. He didn't have relationships with voters in Iowa. He didn't have relationships with voters in New Hampshire or South Carolina. So how are they going to get to know him? He needs to spend time there. So, and in order to do that, we would have a historic number of offices in each state. So in Iowa, we had 37 or 38 offices. Is that right? Isn't there 38? I think 38.
I think it might have been more.
Might have gone to more at the end. But the most anybody had ever had was 17. So we said, Brock's mentality was, you know what? We're going to take our campaign to you. Instead of the mentality, you come to us, we're going to you. And so that's what he did. He spent his time in those 4 states. We raised money because unfortunately or fortunately, it takes money to do a campaign right. The third thing was he was still a senator and he had to go do votes and participate in Congress. And the fourth, and probably most important to Barack, was his family. So making sure that he carved out some time for Michelle and Aaliyah and Sasha. And there's certain things that Barack just wouldn't budge on. Things that they had traditions in their family, like decorating the Christmas tree, like being there for Valentine's, like being there for his anniversary, for being there for the first day of school, for being there for trick-or-treating. There were certain things that he just wouldn't, he didn't care what event it was, that his family mattered. So those were the 4 things, and we stayed very strict to them. And I think that, to be very focused, to be very clear about what it is that you're trying to accomplish and staying focused on that, and then very clear about the message, about what we were trying to do around change. And so I think that he stayed calm and focused was a big part of what made us so successful.
Something that he talks about quite a bit now, and is interesting this week as he's put together his national security team, is kind of this team of rivals approach. So he often references Abraham Lincoln and George Kern Goodwin's book, and talks about bringing together all these different voices that may have very different kind of opinions. As he moves into the administration with this approach, with your experience with the campaign, how did you see this kind of play out during the course of the campaign, and how did you see him kind of use his unique leadership abilities to kind of moderate the dissent within the campaign staff?
Well, I think governing is a very different animal than campaigning, very different. Because campaigning, it's much easier to have, Barack decided that we agreed on a strategy, and he signed up for that strategy, which was, to have aggressive ground operation, to spend his time in the early states, and then as we move through the different states, spending time in those states, and going to places that had never been done before, raising money. And so it's a much different kind of life in a campaign than when you actually govern, because you're making decisions across real decisions that impact people's lives. In a campaign, you're putting together what you would do when you're elected, right? You're putting together because when you have to run for office, all of a sudden you have to have, what's your position on healthcare, environment, the war, the economy. So all of that had to be developed. So one of the things I think you can see as an example of how he'll govern is when we put together our policy positions, we put together policy groups that were pulled not only just experts in Washington, but experts across the country to participate in these policy groups. So we had an environmental policy group that had then subsections to it, and that those groups would work, and as we went through the different policy areas, that those groups would work with Barack and the team to really, what is it that you want to, what is your position, and really think through what that is. And we had over 50 of those groups and over a couple thousand people on those policy groups, and not everybody agreed with each other, and pulled people from different areas. In the beginning, you had in the beginning, not everybody, we didn't have a lot of people that were rushing to our campaign, in the early days. It's not like, and so people that came in the beginning kind of came to us and said, I think you have something here and I want to get involved. And as the months went along, we started to pick up more and more people, and as the other candidates left the race. In the beginning, people have loyalties. Democrats have loyalties, same as Republicans. So they might have had a relationship with Biden or Dodd or Hillary, and so they went in those camps. And then after Iowa, as we started to lose candidates, those people came towards us. And we had an open tent. We very much were open to anyone who wanted to help us. There was lots of volunteer opportunities, there were staff opportunities, and the policy groups were an example of inclusion. Barack is very much about being inclusion and transparent. So the policy groups were one way to do that. And I think you'll see, he has a very much, when I think of Barack Obama, I think of this. It's open, it's inclusionary, it's who he is. So I think you're going to see someone who's very open to different viewpoints. In meetings where there is dissension, Barack is always curious about what people think. if he's in those meetings. And there's a lot of business that takes place where Barack's not in the room. And then that goes into a whole other context of who's leading and what those leadership skills are. And that's for another conversation. But for the conversation of when Barack is in the room, okay, which is those in campaigns unique times, because I always wondered how he did it. I mean, I would, in the second part of the campaign, I traveled and I would go from state to state, and I would do anywhere from, I'd be on the road, as long as 2 weeks, but sometimes as short as a couple days. And I would do, 5, 6, 8 events a day. And after 3 or 4 or 5 days, I would be wiped. And I would think Barack does that day after day after day after day. So campaigns are this different kind of animal. But when he's in the room, he if someone's not speaking, he questions. He asks, what's on your brain? You haven't said anything. What are you thinking? And he's always open. Like if I had an issue, and he'd say, email me, let me know if I wasn't near him. Email me, I want to hear what you have to say. So, he's very much, and he is the modern president with the BlackBerry. And he does respond to people. And as it's gotten crazier in his life, he can't respond to every single email, but he does a really good job of that. And I think you saw that big difference of just the technology aspect of our campaign and his own personal use of technology versus what McCain, who's still getting emails printed off for him, is just a whole different world. But Barack is comfortable with people around him that he A, doesn't know, B, that he thinks they're smarter than him in a specific area, and he actually seeks out people that know more, that he thinks might know more than him. Very, very important aspects of a leader. And there's a quick story, then we'll move on, but Susan Eisenhower is the granddaughter of President Eisenhower, who's been a long-term Republican. And she is an expert on non-nuclear proliferation in the former Soviet Union. And in spring of 2007, Barack called her and said, do you have a few minutes? I'd like to pick your brain. I hear you're the best and brightest on this subject. And after an hour phone call, she was very taken with the questions he was asking, his curiosity, his interest. She said at the end of the phone call, Barack, I'm really impressed that you called, but I can't support you as president. And she said, I have this name to carry, I'm a lifelong Republican. He said, oh no, that's not why I'm calling you. I actually really want to pick your brain. And he said, I hope that you'll allow me to call you back and my staff to call you. So after several months of conversations, Susan finally said, I just couldn't take it anymore. I had to support him. So she called him, and then she said she was practically stalking him. But anyway, she ended up speaking at the Democratic in Denver on the last day, and she became an independent. So that's an example of the kind of thing that Barack does to figure out. And so, when I went into the campaign, I did not have a relationship with him. I had met him a few times. Did not have a friendship or a relationship or even a minor acquaintance. And he was looking, he looks for people for certain roles. And he doesn't necessarily, you don't have to be his best friend or have known him for years. So I think that's a very good thing. I mean, one of the things I used to laugh about in my Clinton White House days is that people used to always say, where in Arkansas are you from? And it was just an assumption that I came from Arkansas. And I think we obviously will have people from Illinois in the White House, Rahm Emanuel, David Axelrod, Valerie Jarrett, but it won't be his whole cabinet and White House staff will not be from Illinois.
It's interesting. It sounds like it comes from a place of kind of real intellectual curiosity and, as you said, inclusion as well. One of the questions that came up a lot, we actually have quite a few international students in the room today, and overwhelmingly everybody is interested. People are doing projects on this. I have a friend doing a PAE on this. Everyone's interested in kind of how his campaign model, so kind of mobilizing volunteers and especially using the internet, can be transferable in other countries. And so very interested in kind of your thoughts in terms of how it can be transferable to politicians and campaign strategists abroad.
Well, yeah, the thing that's so exciting about the Obama campaign is just that we turned the page in using technology for campaigns. And one of the main reasons, aside from the fact that I thought Barack would be an amazing president, but that I wanted to go into the campaign was to see the difference of where we've come to in reaching people. And there's a couple things that I think we did in our campaign, and also just to say, I think one of the reasons that Hillary Clinton lost, because it could have been hers, I believe. But they ran a 1992 campaign in a 2008 year. and they miscalculated the use of technology. Because the use of technology did two things for us. One, we raised money on the internet, and our goal was to get many lower dollar amounts, which we did. And then if someone gives $5 or $10 or $200, we can go back to them and go back to them until they reach the 2,300, which is what we did. So you can raise money that way and reach people in a way that you'd never be able to reach them. And a candidate is only one person. They can only go to so many places. So how do you, and I think what made us so successful is how do you, 300 million people in our country, 150 million of them vote, how do you touch all those people? You have one candidate, one potential first lady, you have so many surrogates, so we did it two ways. And it's not brain surgery. That's the thing about it. It's this really fabulous organization, but it's not so complicated. It's actually very simple. And the simplicity of it actually is and the simplicity and the focus of this campaign I think is what made it so actually spectacular, because we never veered from the strategy. So the two things that I think people can emulate are, number one, the use of the internet to reach people. Now, not only did we raise money on the internet, we used the social networking aspect of it, because what we couldn't do in our campaign, because Barack was so focused on making sure we were a respectful campaign, and part of respect is answering people's phone calls, helping people get involved, but you can't answer every phone call. You're never going to have the staff that is going to be able to answer every phone call, every letter, every email, although we attempted to. But how do you give people the tools to do it on their own? So I can go in and pull up, I want to do a house party, and you don't have to ask my permission. You don't have to go to the campaign and say, can I please hold a house party for 50 women at my house? Actually, we're going to empower you to do that on your own. And here's material coming up, that you can print right off the internet. And if you want to do it around a specific policy area, every single speech that Barack gave, every single policy papers are on the web for you to pull down. We did a bunch of different, participate in this house party. Michelle Obama will be on the line. So we gave people the ability, the tools to get involved without heavy lifting from our point. So I think the aspect of where the internet, and listen, young people, that's what you all do. Facebook, that kinds of social networking. It's a whole new world, and for people over 40, which a lot of campaign operatives are, is hard to grasp a little bit. So young people have infused this campaign. I think ahead of our new media was 27, Joe Rossburst, who had run new media for Governor Dean when he was 24 or 23. So Chris Hughes, who went to Harvard and he started Facebook. And so Chris worked on our campaign, and he was all of 23 or something. So we really pulled from these young, brilliant minds of technology. So I think the technology aspect, and then this is what I say to candidates, is be yourself. I think there's something about being authentic. People think, well, if I just do these 5 things, if I wear my hair a certain way, I say these words, I do this, then I can win. And I think what Barack showed us is that actually if you are true to who you are, to who you really are, and what you want to do for your country or your town or your city, and that you include people, that you make people feel like they matter in your campaign by using technology, by using surrogates, by organizing a variety of ways, town hall meetings, house parties, picnics, that people can get involved. Now that isn't new to politics. House parties and picnics and town halls, that's not new. But what's new is helping people self-organize, but being part of the campaign, but self-organizing. And so we were able to build our numbers. And there's 2 people in the audience I would love, and you can tell me when to weave them in, because I think they have some great thoughts on this. But Samir Randolph, who's in the front row, worked here with me at CPL, joined our campaign, came to Chicago, worked in our operations department, and then we sent him out. You first went to Iowa, and then from Iowa to California to
Texas, West Virginia, New Hampshire.
And then he was in New Hampshire for all of the general. And And he has, so I want him to say a few things because I think this is what adds. And then Saba Berhain in the back, she's a young woman who also joined our campaign, came to Chicago. We ended up putting her as a state director in Alabama, which is not a state we thought we could win or would win, but you know, every state, we took them seriously, every state. And so I'd love for them, I don't know when might weave them in and say a few things about what's different about our campaign.
Well, while we're on this topic, maybe if you could each take a couple minutes now.
Sure. I guess I started in Chicago and then moved to Iowa, where the first thing I noticed on the wall of the office in Iowa City was this poster. And to go to Betsy's point about empowering people, that's what we did the best. And you know, it came from the top, it came from Barack, and everyone who worked on the campaign, you know, lived this. And this was our motto, was respect, empower, and include. And so yeah, I'll just read a couple things. You know, it has a quote from Barack from his, you know, his announcement speech, and then, you know, respect. Our campaign promises to respect the Iowa caucus process, the Democratic Party, local parties, so on and so on. Our campaign promises to respect activists, volunteers, and anyone we come into contact with. They shall be listened to and responded to. So it speaks to what Betsy said about responding to people, listening, and so we had a hierarchy in the campaign, but everyone listened to each other. If you know, and it wasn't, you could pass up suggestions to your regional field director, your bosses, and people would listen and take it into account. And I think that, you know, and especially with volunteers. So people come in and they have ideas, and volunteers, we had tons of people who were just very excited and sometimes got a little carried away, but you know, we did respect their ideas. I mean, in Texas, we had a group of people who opened an office and put a Che Guevara you know, flag in the background, and it was just like, oh my God. But you know, you know, I'm still dealing with someone who paid for an office on his own and is now trying to be reimbursed. So it's like, I mean, so you have people who just have this interest and, you know, this enthusiasm, and I think we, you know, we encourage that and empower them to take on a piece of the campaign. Yeah, that was amazing. Another thing that I think was successful was our Fed 5 states strategy. We started, you know, you worked in Alabama, I think that was a Fed 5 state. Yeah, so, you know, the big focus for every campaign, Hillary's, ours, Edwards, was on the first 4 states, Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada, and then South Carolina. But, you know, we had the resources, or we put a lot of our resources towards the Fed 5 states, the Super Tuesday. And we kind of, you know, we had volunteers all around the country who wanted to get involved, and instead of saying, you know, we'll be there on, you know, January 26th, we started in the beginning of September. I went with the national field director, John Carson. We went up to Wisconsin, and about 4 of us packed up 132 computers over, you know, 8 hours. Some company leased some computers to us, and we sent them out to all of the Fed 5 states, and we sent maybe 2 or 3 staff to each one of those states and just opened an office and got people involved. And that was successful, particularly in the caucus states, where, you know, Hillary's campaign didn't pay a lot of attention to them, but we did. And, you know, we won Kansas and Colorado and Minnesota, and you know, in the end it was about delegates. So I think that was really one of the key reasons why we won. So I guess that's all.
And then as a person in the field, like,
Oh,
what was
Well, I did a lot of the operational stuff, dealing with leases and vendors, all the staff hirings, and you know, this also came from you and Henry, that we follow through on our commitments. So, you know, in past years, a lot of vendors wouldn't get paid. You know, when I was just up in New Hampshire, the chairman of the New Hampshire Democratic Party would always say to me, he's like, "You're going to stay around after this is over," because a lot of people get burned. And what are you going to do? Call the president and say, "Oh, you owe me money?" It's like, yeah, whatever. But we follow through on our commitments, and I think that's another reason, you're working with people in the community, you respect them, and, you respect them enough to follow through on your commitments. I think that was one thing that I felt most proud of, and, came from the top. I don't know what else I have to say. Yeah.
But the respect thing, I think what Samir is saying, respect was a key ingredient of our campaign. It's a respectful leadership. What does that mean across? And paying, early on we said, we are going to pay our vendors early from the top. And, people are so used to campaigns not doing that. And so we were very respectful of that. And then what we did is that we called some of the vendors and said, we'll pay you on time or we'll pay you early if you lower your cost. And so we negotiated and got things at less price. We negotiated with Visa and some other credit card companies. If you lower your points, we'll pay you on time or pay you early. And so people started to trust us over time. And not only did we pay our bills on time, increase our credit, but we had goodwill out into the community with vendors and could get stuff done quickly or last minute.
Yeah, and we knew how much we were spending, and that's a huge part of it. One of my friends, Pete Dager, he worked in the Clinton White House. He's the biggest character. He saved the campaign, I would say $500,000 easily by setting up, negotiating with vendors, and just cutting costs within. People would order the fancy highlighters, and he would just deny it, and then they'd go back and order, something else a lot cheaper. And I think he saved the campaign hundreds of thousands of dollars single-handedly. So, and shipping and just little things that you don't think of that I saw and heard from other people on other campaigns that they didn't really take into consideration. It was just like money out the door, and we didn't do that. So I think that also led to some of our success. So. Yeah.
So I just want to return back to something that Betsy was talking about. The two things that I thought were really awesome about the campaign was the power of Barack and his personality, and then the way that the campaign was run. So going back to my story, I was in England just graduating, studying international relations, and saying, I don't know what the hell I'm going to be doing now. And there is a campaign going on, but what's up with that? And my mentor, Tony Lake, who was the former National Security Advisor to President Clinton, I called him and was like, I hear you're like supporting Barack. Really? Explained it to me and said, listen, this guy's amazing. And it is not about supporting, someone I've been, quote, loyal to or I'm friends with. That doesn't change, but he's really awesome. And since you don't have a job and you're not doing anything with yourself, why don't you bring your butt to Chicago and work in the policy department, which is where I was before I went to Alabama. And the policy department was managed very well, as you said. Too many people, and as you guys are here, there'll be a lot of egos, a lot of ideas, and so we were able to successfully put that together and say everybody matters. And so that was a lot of fun. And yet, how did I meet Betsy? The campaign was so horizontal in its approach. It wasn't this sort of hierarchy where you couldn't get to know people who were heading different departments, even if you were in one department. And I remember going to Betsy when they had decided that maybe I could be useful, and this goes back to the way the campaign was run, maybe I could be useful in helping them determine strategy or whatever with getting African American women more involved. There was a bit of a pull there between whether African American women were going to support Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama. And since I had worked on campaigns doing a lot of constituency work, they thought I could be helpful. So here I was sort of shifting out of policy for a bit, and I got a chance to meet Earth and Cousin, who was a senior advisor, and Betsy. And then when John Carson came to me and gave me this, and I've been doing this for months now, working in the policy department and doing this, John Carson goes, well, we're thinking of sending you to Alabama. Carson, I'm from Boston. But he's like, no, honestly, we really believe that, and this is the management thing, we can shift you as a resource there and really do something there. We don't want to just leave Alabama hanging and assume because there are a lot of African Americans there that they're just going to automatically support Barack. And we think that your relationship to communities like this might make it easy for you to get to know us. I'm still from Boston. I'm not, how are you going to send me to Alabama? So I go to Betsy. I go to Betsy, and I'm like, Betsy, I want to go to Alabama. And here's someone who's running a different department and taking the time out to talk to me, one of many people working on the campaign in Chicago, and says to me, listen, I think if you really put your mind to it, you could do it. It's going to be a great opportunity for you. It's going to really challenge you, and it's going to be a benefit to the campaign. You could stay here and do what you like, or you could go somewhere else and try something new. And that's what I did. And in Alabama, to say the least, besides the fact that the February 5 strategy was an amazing one, here we had people whose last major campaign was Jesse Jackson say, wow, it means a lot to us that Barack Obama is willing to send you and also to spend money to open offices. We had 6 offices. I managed 6 offices in Alabama where people just figured that people would automatically vote for him, and it was not true. When I got down there, we hadn't won Iowa yet, and people were very skeptical of Barack Obama. And so we did a lot of work to sort of get his name out there and his ideas out there. Policy, I was able to actually integrate my policy background and say, these are the things that, connect you to this man. And I mean, it was a love affair like it is for everybody else with Barack Obama. And they were very excited. And to this day, I have people in Alabama who email me and say, you don't know how much it means that you were down there and you reinvigorated us, and we believe now we can do tons of things. We can change politics in Alabama because we were able to vote in Barack Obama. So that's sort of my experience. And I just thought it was amazing.
Yeah.
So happy to see. Can I give her a hug, guys?
Thanks, Salma. So that's an example of 2 of our fabulous young people of this campaign, and we had, I think we got to 2,500 staff, and in the general we staffed every state with young people. How many?
5,000 by the end.
5,000.
Yeah.
All, and of the 5,000, all paid stipend. Paid.
Yeah.
So yeah, and this campaign went up and down in staff. We went, and we staffed up, for Super Tuesday, and then we went back down, and so it was very interesting, and people kind of flowed with that. When you're younger, you can do that a little more, but it is an amazing. So 5,000 paid staff, and then hundreds and hundreds.
We had 7,000 volunteers in New Hampshire on election day.
Think of that.
Knocking on doors, making phone calls. People
7,000.
are just sick of our
Yeah.
volunteers. They're like,
Yeah.
I'm voting for them, leave me alone. and in Iowa, for the last week leading up to the caucus, we had 2,000 people working there, volunteering full-time. That was my position. I coordinated about 200 people in my region for working out of 2 offices to knock on doors and make phone calls. We knocked on about 30,000 doors a day leading up to the caucus. But that's what wins.
Betsy, it's great to see you model the same inclusive approach that Barack Obama has in his leadership. Thank you both for sharing your thoughts today. I'll just ask one more question, and then we'll open it up to questions from all of you. One of the roles that you've played, both in the Clinton administration and then with Obama, with President-elect Obama, is working with women. So leading up the first office of Women's Affairs and Outreach, and then leading up Women for Obama as well. We'd love to hear from you today in terms of kind of the role of gender was very prominent in the campaign this year. And so how you believe that will influence kind of politics and government even moving forward. And along that line, kind of how you envision President Obama integrating women's affairs into his administration.
Well, one of the interesting things about Barack as a leader is how he views equality, that he believes that just where he comes from, right, his natural state of being is that women and men are equal, that black and white equal, Hispanic and white equal, Asian and Hispanic equal, that's just where he comes from. And so it's not, I think in past leaders, it's been, well, we got to have our quotas. And not even, I shouldn't even use that word quota, that's a funky word, but we need to, it was more of, maybe they weren't totally there, but they knew they needed to do it. But Barack comes to it from different, which was what I found, one of the pieces that I found so fascinating. I think that's part of being this new generation of leader. is that, to not say, well, I need to make sure I have 3 women and, and he even said on the first staff meeting, this campaign is gonna represent this country. This country is made up of not just black, white, but brown and Asian and gay and lesbian and young and old, and all the religions, and, let's try to have the most diverse campaign staff we can. I think we did a pretty good job. I don't think we were 100% fabulous, but I think Brock continued to challenge us as we went, how are we doing on that? When we go into the general, how are we doing? And I think you're gonna see that as he sets up his government, it's gonna be a very diverse government and making sure that people are the best qualified. Because at the end of the day, I remember when Madeleine Albright became the first woman Secretary of State, and how that day the phone calls and telegrams and good wishes to President Clinton about Madeleine Albright, and I was with him that day, and I said, Mr. President, are you surprised at the outpouring we've had across the world? And because I was just really taken with it, the letters that were coming in and calls to the women's office. And he said to me, I am. He said, because the truth is that I knew it was a big deal, but at the end of the day, I chose Madeleine Albright not because she was a woman, but because she was best for the job. And that's inequality, that's what we're looking for, and so that's what you're gonna see in a President Obama, is that you're gonna have people of all backgrounds and colors in jobs because they're the most qualified for that position. That's what he's striving for, and I think that's what's different. So I found in him this interest of, this part of Barack that was like, well, men and women are equal. And so I think you're gonna see, it had not been decided yet how the White House Women's Office, my office, which was created in 1995 by President Clinton, was a brand new office. Historically, the women's outreach in the White House has been part of public liaison, and the public liaison office is the office inside the White House that has all of the outreach functions under it, so African American, Hispanic, business, religion, and women was just what we call a desk. And what President Clinton did in partnership with Hillary Clinton was to create this office that was separate, but worked with public liaison, but was separate, and had a very high title. It was a deputy assistant to the president. It was in the senior staff meetings. It was, and could get the work. You've got to have those. It's got to be the right stature in government to get the work done, and it was. And when President Bush came in, they closed the White House Women's Office. Now, it was not, President Bush did not look at his staff and go, oh, let's close the White House Women's Office. What happened was Karl Rove came in, and Karl Rove wanted to create an Office of New Initiatives, and so he scooped people, because the White House only has so many appointments, so many positions. You can't just say, I'd like to add another 200 positions. There's so many positions, so the president has to, what matters to them is how they formulate those offices. So he scooped positions out of intergovernmental and public liaison to create his new initiatives. So the women's piece of the Bush White House went back to a desk. So you can imagine that lots of women across this country are waiting with bated breath about what President Obama is going to do with the White House Women's Office. But not only the White House Women's Office, all the women's offices across government, which there are many. So the Women's Office at the Small Business Administration, the Women's Bureau at the Labor Department, the Women's Health Office at HHS, the Women's Office in the Department of Justice that helps to eradicate domestic violence. All of those offices, and there's many more, have, during the Bush years, because whatever extra money there is has been scooped out to pay for the war, a lot of those offices have been almost decimated. So, part of what we're doing in the Obama transition is we have agency review teams that go into every agency and say, well, where are we now 8 years later? What has happened to the positions? What's happened, by regulation and legislation, and where are we? And what we're taking a look at is every one of the women's offices, and what is the Obama administration going to do to restore back to at least the levels of the Clinton years and more. So all of those things are being looked at right now, and there has not been any decisions yet on the White House Women's Office. But I will tell you that women will play a very integral and important role in the Obama White House and across the agencies. And you're already seeing the top women that he's putting in place. Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State, Janet Napolitano as the head of the Homeland Security, Susan Rice. I mean, so you got three. When you think about that, that's three women, and then you've got inside the White House, Melody Barnes is an African-American woman who's heading up policy team. Valerie Jarrett, African-American woman who's going to oversee public liaison and intergovernmental. Another African-American woman who's going to be deputy chief of staff. A Hispanic woman, Cecilia Munoz, who's going to be the director of intergovernmental. So far he's doing pretty good.
Woman from Emily's List.
Yes. Yes, the woman from Emily's List Communications, and her name is escaping me. She's someone I don't know, actually. Did you say Ellen Moran?
Is it?
I think it's Ellen Moran.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it is. But anyways, so that's, I think so far so good. And we will see. Yeah.
As a woman, that's great to hear.
And then let me just say that our First Lady, Michelle Obama, is going to play a very, I think, important role. She cares deeply about this issue of balancing work and family, which she really set out in the campaign from her own experiences, having two little ones, working. How do we balance that? How do we get support in our lives? But then she's also, as she's been out across the country, been meeting with military families and seeing the devastation that the Iraq War has brought to our American military families, and she's going to play a role in that as well. But it'll be wonderful to see what she does. I think she's going to be a very strong and important First Lady and leader in the upcoming administration.
I think now let's open it up to questions from all of you. Yep.
Yeah. Thanks for coming. One of the things that surprised me was that not only did Barack Obama not make many mistakes during this long, grueling process over the last 2 years, but also with a few notable exceptions. There weren't many of his surrogates or many of his advisors that they might have made mistakes, but there were very few that were publicly revealed and kind of took on a story to itself. Was there a strategy within the campaign of sort of either vetting surrogates or and how did that happen? Because when you have such a groundswell of volunteers who are empowered to speak on behalf of the candidate, it was just amazing that I thought that there weren't many other public events that were kind of gaps.
Yeah, we had an entity inside the campaign that dealt with surrogates, and those surrogates were actually paid for people. And so we would ask somebody to come, and Susan Eisenhower, for example, did a lot of campaigning, and so her trips might be navigated through the surrogate office. But then every state had their surrogate program as well, and states had some ability to decide who should come into their states and who would be paid for. But the surrogates that were invited to come were vetted. I mean, we knew who they were. I think the surrogates, we ran a pretty tight ship on, here's the talking points. And, you had to take, because I did a ton of surrogating, you had to take it upon yourself as well to study so that you knew if you're going into a town hall and you're going to be opening up for questions, you better know what all his policies are. But not every surrogate felt 100% comfortable knowing every one of Barack's policies, so we would have staff with them that could answer some of the questions. They might feel comfortable talking about foreign policy, but not be comfortable about healthcare or energy. Someone like me, I knew could talk to any of them, but I couldn't go deep into like minutia, of Medicaid, Medicare, down into 18 levels. So you went in there, you did the best you could, but you had to study. And we had specific talking points that you stayed on. We were also pretty controlled about who went on media and who didn't go on media. You couldn't just get on media. Even at my level, you couldn't just say, I think I'll go on, because I would get calls to go on X or Z show. And you just wouldn't go on without having approval because, you have to understand that there's a bigger strategy that that the communications team might be trying to put in place that day, whatever that was. And so you just had to trust and play, that this was an organization that was pretty controlled. And I think that's one of the things in this, you're already seeing it in the transition, we're a pretty controlled organization, and people need to stick to what the messages are of the day, the week, the month, and I think that's why you didn't see a lot of gaffes. And when we did, everybody made mistakes every so often. You said something to a reporter, you hoped you didn't, and it shows up or whatever. But for the most part, and I don't know if you guys on the ground have anything you want to add to that.
Yeah, I do. You know, the line was don't talk to the press. And,
Yeah.
you know, every staff member knew that from the bottom up.
Right.
Just, you know, the first call you make if a reporter comes into your office is to the communications office. So
Yeah.
it was very controlled, you know, and limited the amount of gaffes that
Right.
were made. I mean,
Yeah.
a friend of mine was on the cover of the Des Moines Register and, you know, said something like, "This is great," or, you know, there was a little quote, and she got in trouble for it. I mean,
Yeah.
or, you know, someone talked to her about it, and not just,
Right, because the campaign was pretty tough about, well, if we have an opportunity to put someone on the cover of the Des Moines Register, we want to be able to make sure we put the best person possible, not just every campaign staff. And, you know, there was even, you know, in the early days, people that would, if you were too out there, you'd be fired. And it was, I don't think we ever fired anybody, but it was like, you know, it was a stressful thing. You just don't go talking to the press, you know, because can you imagine? You know, you have 5,000 people talking to the press with their ideas, and so anyway, so I think that that was a very tightly run ship.
And our circuits were really good. I mean, I remember when we were in South Carolina and I had the staff, like, let's say someone like Eric Holder, these people feel like they should be able to say anything.
Yeah.
But they were very comfortable with having people sit with them and say, "Hi, Mr. Holder, you're amazing. I'm just going to give you talking points." And they didn't care, and they were just so excited to be there. And that's something that I found really fascinating, because you didn't really get pushback. People were comfortable, like surrogates were comfortable with getting talking points and having someone say, you know, we're sticking to it, you know, just his policy position. Let's try not to make it personal.
And I think what you're talking about is another reason why we didn't have a lot of gaps, is because people were staffed appropriately. So they were given briefing books, and and talking points, and, you know, issues, and then there was staff with them as they traveled. So, you know, there wasn't a lot of room to make gaps, because if they didn't know how to answer something, there'd be a staff person there that did. And so I think that was part of our execution on the ground, was the staff on the ground would make sure the surrogates were really, really managed properly, but professionally. And I think surrogates going into it, I actually always appreciated when someone traveled with me, because they might understand the state. Like, for example, I'll tell you where it was really helpful. When I would go into many, many states, every single state, it was different on how people could register to vote, and the absentee ballots, and it got really confusing. And so, you know, that wasn't an area that I really needed to memorize, because I was moving in and out of the states. So there was always staff with me, you know, that would brief me and say, this is what the deal is in Virginia. And, you know, because there's so much coming at you, or there might be a local issue that's hot on the table, that they're gonna assume you know about, and so that local team will, you know, local races going on, like in New Hampshire, we had so much going on with Jean Shaheen and Carol Shea Porter and others, and so just your surrogates need to know all that coming into a state. So it's not just the talking points, it's also what's going on in the state, and what's the history, and when's Barack been there before, and, you know, so all that stuff, and that takes staff work.
We've got another question right here.
Hi. I'm intrigued by your concepts of the horizontal approach to the campaign, particularly when you're welcoming a multiplicity of views, and you've said several times the simplicity and focus. How do you maintain intellectual rigor? Because often those elements lead to either paralysis by analysis or a dumbing down of a message and an approach. And it sounds like the simplicity of focus actually helped the intellectual rigor rather than make things cumbersome. I'm just curious on, from a leadership point of view, how you achieve that. I work at the United Nations.
Oh. You know, I mean, I think, and it's so different for governing and campaigning, okay? Because the intellectual rigor of a campaign is really about the policy positions that are set up and established. And, you know, some of that even for Barack was new, because he'd thought through a lot of issues, but, you know, there's a lot of intricacies inside the energy policy, for example, or, you know, and so the intellectual rigor was really on those policy teams that were, and as the world was changing, we walked into the economic disaster, you know, those that intellectual rigor was really in that area of what are the policy positions, what are we telling the country we're going to do, how are we going to do it, how are we going to pay for it. You know, all of that was being analyzed through the policy groups, and then once those decisions were made, then down into the field to be able to disseminate it through our talking points, through the web, through house parties, through material in the local offices. And so that's really the intellectual rigor, I would say, of a campaign. Because at the end of the day, campaigns are like hand-to-hand combat in a way. You know, they really are. It's so simple. It's like the campaign that it has a clear message, a candidate that people feel comfortable with, they feel they can trust, and we get our people to the polls. We get them registered, and we get them engaged, and we get them to the polls. So in some ways, campaigns are not intellectually rigorous. They're really organizational. Yeah. They're discipline. Organizational discipline, organizational, I mean, we out-organized is what we did. And we out-organized Hillary Clinton, and we out-organized John McCain. And let me just tell you that it was so amazing. I mean, what the beautiful thing of a long primary season was we went to all 50 states and 3 territories. And we organized in those states. And so when we went back there for the general, we had all kinds of relationships in those states, volunteers already going. So I spent a lot of time in Virginia because Virginia was such an important state for us. McCain had to win Virginia. And we had, at the end, 50 offices in Virginia. He had 5. Think about that. We had 70 offices in Pennsylvania. He had like 9 or something, not even that many. So, you know, we out-organized, we out-volunteered, we raised money. They couldn't even compete with us. They didn't even, I can't even believe it. You know, I mean, it was actually a detriment for McCain to win so early, because he kind of just hung out for a few months. And what he should have been doing was they should have been organizing those 50 states and getting offices on the ground. And had anybody done their homework and looked what we did, how did Barack Obama go from 10% name ID to being the nominee? It looked like we were going to be the nominee. But regardless, you know, they should have been organizing. So they didn't really hold a chance. They didn't have a chance when you looked at the way we organized. I don't know how you, in New Hampshire, so McCain was, and that's an interesting state because McCain was loved there.
Yeah. But we kind of hammered home the fact that he's voted with McCain or Bush 90% of the time. And that's what we went with pretty much the whole time.
And we out-organized.
And we out-organized. We had thousands of volunteers every week from Massachusetts who came up. The New Hampshire folks were probably pretty tired from the primary,
Yeah.
but we had thousands of volunteers every weekend, knocking on doors, making phone calls, and that's ultimately the difference. You know, you make contact. You know, with Barack, there was a lot of misinformation out there, so talking to people and, you know, dispelling that was the name of the game for us. And so the more people that, you know, David Plouffe said this a lot, you know, the more people, or he said this a lot during the primary, the more people who get to know him like him. And so that's what we had to do.
Yeah, we knew that. We knew that from the earliest times, that the more, like in Iowa, as people got to know Barack, they concentrated on who he was and what he stood for and where he wanted to take the country, they came our way. So it was an amazing thing. So that got us, we had to get out there and have the one-on-one conversations to alleviate some of the...
And there were a lot of one-on-one conversations. I mean, Iowans, they're a spoiled bunch. I mean, you know, like, and in New Hampshire, like, I was, you know, when we mentioned Susan Rice, a friend of mine was joking the other day that she was in a house meeting with 3 people, you know? And it's like, that's what it took. I mean,
Yeah.
we put these surrogates out there and they would talk to 3 and 5 people. It adds up after a while.
Well, and you know, I did some of those house parties too, where there was, 5 or 6 people, but those 5 or 6 people, those 5 or 6 people who showed up to a house party on a cold, snowy night, come because they care. And then if those 5 or 6 people leave convinced, they go out and tell 10 plus more, so all of a sudden you touched 5, but you really touched 100.
respected those people. We didn't take them for granted.
And that goes back to the
And that
respect
passes,
principle.
that goes
Yeah.
further than just that person.
Yes.
One comment on that and one question. The best line I ever heard when I was canvassing in New Hampshire was, a gentleman went to their door and he said, the reason why Barack's campaign is doing so well is they're not taking yes for an answer. And that, you got touched once, and then you got touched twice, and you got touched and touched and touched and touched, and it was this ferocious adoption of people into this campaign, and I thought that was just really well said. You don't take yes for an answer. I am curious to know, with all the amazing organizing that was done, how big do you think the drop in the economy was, the contribution to the win? While it was a relative landslide statewide, it wasn't a wide landslide voting-wise.
Right.
I wanted to get a sense of where do you think we stand as a country. While he's inclusive, he's still relatively divided.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting is that, I used to say this a lot after the primary. We used to say, oh, isn't it great? 18 million people voted for Hillary and 18 million people voted for Barack. Okay, think about that. That's 36 million people. There's 300 million in the country, right? So I used to go out and say to people, we've just begun our job here because there's 270 million people who don't know who Barack Obama is. So we have a big job ahead of us, when you think about all the people that needed to be educated, included, and involved in the campaign. And so there was still a lot of people going into the general that were uncomfortable with who Barack, they just weren't, it was different, a lot of things, his color, his name, he was new, what did he really do, what has he done before, and, all those things that people were a little uncomfortable. Okay, then you add in this, and I spent 3 months doing unity efforts, okay? You add in the Hillary women that were beside themselves. And I would say if there's one thing that our campaign maybe didn't do, if I could go back in time, I think we could have done better, was really embrace the Hillary, understand the depth of the despondent Hillary supporters. And in that context, I spent 3 months in meetings, venues with Hillary supporters in states where there were certain states where it was more prevalent, and New Hampshire was one state, Washington D.C. with a lot of the women leaders, New York, Boston here, so that so you had the Hillary women. So when we came out of the convention, I was like, oh man, I knew we still had a lot of work to do. But then a couple things happened, I think, that went right there. We stayed steady to our campaign, stayed steady to our strategy, which we always did. We had so many offices in every state. So we knew in such an aggressive voter registration program. So we knew we had so many new voters. And in the debates, Barack stayed steady to who he was and made us proud. And then you had Sarah Palin. And Sarah Palin in the beginning was, I think she knocked us off our game a little bit, and even knocked Barack off for a couple days, because it was such a surprise.
You could feel it in leading up to the Republican convention. Everyone was cocky, and it was just like, we won this thing. And you could see it in the number of volunteers who came in the office. It went down, and then that week after, it was like desperation. There were folks in there, like, seriously, they're all night making phone calls. The numbers of volunteers just went through the roof after they had their convention, because people were nervous.
Yeah, and I think, I don't know if you all remember, there was a great column by Gail Collins in the New York Times right around that time, like, come on, Democrats, gotta get a grip. Because I literally, there was so much hand-wringing going on, and I would go to these events, oh my God, we're gonna lose Sarah Palin. It was like, and we do that as Democrats sometimes, so there were, the ups and downs of campaigns, but the bottom line was Barack stayed steady, and, Palin started to implode, and then the economic crisis. And this is just my own opinion of watching this thing, that I think a couple things happened. She had the Katie Couric interview, and people started to go, not sure I'm comfortable with her, if something were to happen to John McCain, and all of a sudden his age became more of a factor, than it really was, because listen, 72 is not that old, and there's a lot of great people doing great things at 72, but all of a sudden it's like, well, 72 and has had some cancer and So people started to take a little closer look at Sarah Palin, and then the economic crisis, and then John McCain did his little thing that he did about, I'm gonna go to Washington and not do the debate, and that backfired on him. And, you know, I think from that moment on, from the moment that he said, I'm going to Washington, and that was the second debate, I think, it just was like, I mean, we just were like that. It was really, now, I have friends in the McCain world. And one of the things that, it's always good to have friends on both sides of the aisle, but one of the things I found so fascinating from a leadership perspective about these two decisions that John McCain made, the economic crisis and Sarah Palin, they were both shoot from the hip leadership decisions. They were not thought through. And he just decided, you know, and they weren't who he was, because he didn't want to pick Sarah Palin. He wanted to pick, he had Lieberman on the short list and Ridge, and the governor from Minnesota. And he picked Palin. It was really against who he really wanted, but she was true to the base. And then the economic crisis was, well, you know, he was feeling his campaign slipping, so why don't I do something? And both of those were shoot from the hip. And if you look at how Barack Obama chose Joe Biden, so we got our glimpse as a country, the first presidential decision, and one of the most important decisions that a presidential candidate will make, who is my VP, and what's the process that I go through to make it. And Paul Begala on CNN said something I thought was so true. He said choosing a presidential candidate, choosing their vice presidential candidate is like buying a life insurance policy. Those people who buy life insurance for their families are people who love other people. And God forbid something happens to Barack, there's not a person in this country that wouldn't think that Joe Biden could step in tomorrow and be a fabulous president, one of the top foreign policy experts in the world. And Barack thought about it, and he took time about it, and he interviewed, and he thought, who's going to be someone who's going to, you know, challenge my thinking? Who's going to be my partner? Who's going to be someone who could lead the country? John McCain, shoot from the hip, chose Sarah Palin, talked to her for 15 minutes. So that's just one example. I talked about that a lot across the country. Wow. You know, and, you know, Barack, with the economic crisis, he didn't think that going to Washington and getting in the midst of this decision package was actually helpful. It created, with their motorcade and their Secret Service and the press and the campaigns, how is that helpful? It actually creates chaos. See, what Barack Obama does, he takes chaos away. He takes drama away. Instead of creating it, he takes it away. And that's what's different about him. He has a temperament and is emotionally healthy. I've seen in my life, it's getting longer, a lot of leaders and a lot of, you know, presidents and mayors and governors. And I will stand by this today to tell you that Barack Obama is the healthiest leader I've ever worked for. The healthiest in, you know, like healthy physically, but mentally healthy person. And I think that's the thing, that he's so confident. And people who say, well, Barack's a little aloof, there's an aspect of him that I think is really interesting, is that he's in this for the right reasons. And he can't, not everyone's going to love him, and he's actually okay with that. Had Barack lost on November 4th, he wouldn't be on a heap on the floor figuring out what to do with his life. He would be like, okay, what did I learn? And go on with my life. So I was taken with that he was actually in this for the right reasons. And we're going to see, I think he's going to be a fabulous president. Yes?
Just a quick question.
Yeah.
You talked a lot about this culture and how this culture came from the top, from Barack Obama. But my question, this is for Samir as well, is not just Jim Messina and Steve Hildebrand and sort of senior staff, but how does that filter down this culture and reinforcing this culture within the organization to say the Ami Copelands on your finance team, or you know, your Alyssa Mesher Monacos? What are the tools that they use, or your volunteer coordinators, to reinforce that culture? Because is it just this wonderful leader at the top, or, for example, you had a sign in every field office that laid out sort of the vision of what you wanted? What are some of those organizational tools to help reinforce that culture? Are there more like this sign?
You want to talk from a field perspective? Both of you guys, from a field perspective? Was there anything, I mean, because not everybody, listen, organizations are people. And not every person who you just mentioned, actually, what I say is one of those kinds of leaders. And so Barack does set the culture. Barack did set the tone of no drama. Now, I would challenge the no drama from a leadership standpoint, because one of the problems with no drama is no voices. And you've got to make sure that no drama in a government, it's different, campaign is different, because it's a very strategic, this is what we're doing, it's a short period of time, and we're going to execute that strategy with some adjustments as we go along. Government is totally different. And everything that Barack's going to be dealing with on his plate, you know, is going to be very different from a campaign. But, you know, there was part of the reason David Plouffe, similar to Barack in the way that he was very calm, very focused, very deliberative on his, like he knew exactly where we were going. David Plouffe didn't have a lot of people skills, and he was an introvert. You see on a scale, he just was an introvert, but a really good human being. And never, what I found interesting that was common between Plouffe and Barack was when something went wrong, neither of them pointed fingers. It's like, okay, you did this. It's like, what did we do, and how can we improve on this? And so I found that very interesting. And so between Barack setting it and then Plouffe really implementing that, you know, you kind of set the culture. Not everybody, because everyone has their personalities, fell in total line with that, but I think it was the culture.
I think it was the culture.
Yeah.
But at the end, during the general, you had people who were brought in from other campaigns or, you know, outside of any of the campaigns who, you know, either chiefs of staff or, you know, whoever from government who had the campaign experience to run the state. And things did get messy because, you know, we had staff who were OFA, Obama for America, working for a while, and then now they're being directed by people who, you know, may not have been, weren't around that culture the whole time.
Right.
And so things did get a little messy at the end.
Yeah, I think it's true, because people, I mean, you think about the organization growing so fast overnight, and then you try, like Ami Copeland is one of our top finance guys, you know, there's certain people that are attracted to certain aspects of a campaign, and Ami Copeland came in as our deputy head of finance in the campaign, and Ami and Juliana Smoot were, you know, amazing fundraisers. And people who get into the fundraising world have often different personalities than people who maybe get into the field organization or who get into communication, right? So there are different, and in any organization, there's just different personalities, and then you have to take into context that, wow, some of these people were there for 2 years, people get tired, there's no time off, there's no personal time, people go through things in their life, they lose parents, they lose siblings, they have marriage troubles, and so it's life, right? So it gets, but at the end of the day, I think Barack set this culture, and we set in place the organization to say, we're inclusive, we have lots of field offices, the volunteers matter, the voters matter, our staff matters. So you set the tone, and it is a little, can get a little, you know, it's not perfect, because people aren't perfect in any organization, but, and I think it is interesting, and it'd be something to actually explore what happened when we brought in so many new people.
And also during the general, you're also dealing with a coordinated campaign. So we're up there in New Hampshire, the Campaign for Change, trying to elect Barack Obama. By the end, we're also working for Jeanne Shaheen and some of the people down the ballot. So, you know, you're dealing with their organization. So who's in charge? It's kind of the same.
Yeah. Does that answer your question? It's kind of a messy answer to your question, actually.
I know there are many more questions, but it is 4 o'clock, and so it's time to say thank you to all of you for coming today, and a special thanks to Betsy Myers for your time and sharing all of your insights this afternoon. We're very lucky today at the Kennedy School because Betsy will be speaking again at 6 o'clock today in Wiener Auditorium, specifically around an issue that we didn't really get to it all today, which is around working in the administration. And I'd like to thank you very much. Just going to have a short interview with BBC Radio following today's event, but I imagine she'll be around for some questions.
I'll definitely stick around if you don't mind.
Thank you.